Today, through our immanent lenses, I just got progressive lenses for the first time this week, and it's making me feel a little bit wobbly. But nonetheless, if you see through these lenses of the immanent frame in our secular world, you don't tend to talk about demons and angels being behind every bush. You don't walk out in the Marietta Square and talk about God really loudly to random people that you don't know. Whereas in the year 1500, you would have been expected to do that. They would think we were strangely robotic today. But all to say, we live in this world. This is the world we've all been a part of. So how do we talk about God in an immanent frame without just talking about symbols or metaphors or feelings, but also not just talking about things that sound foolish today? How do we do this? And as we talked about in the Bible, when we look through the Bible, we look at these miracle stories. They tend to start with people who are in a position of need or want, and they usually express their want or their need. And then there's this moment of wonder. That is to say, a wondrous thing happens, something that is amazing, but also that causes them to wonder, who did this? Why did this happen? And as we said, the meaning or the explanation isn't always given. Actually, it's almost never given. The Egyptians don't fully understand why the seas have parted. That people who watch Jesus do his miracles sometimes say, who is doing this? What's the power behind this? Is this Beelzebub, right? Is this the devil doing this? Is this God doing this? Is this a different God doing, which God is doing this? A lot of people in the ancient world would have asked. That is to say, the meaning isn't always fully encapsulated in the encounter or in the event, but something prompts the people to wonder. And then there are certain people who perceive this or experience this wonderful thing that then go on to witness. And they have to, in a way, kind of explain it. And for many of them, they interpret this event, and then they explain their interpretation of the event, and they proclaim it to other people. And it's this idea of meaning. What's the meaning or the purpose of this thing that I've seen, or this thing I've experienced, this thing I've witnessed? And that is particularly important. And it's, again, not always given. So we talked about this last week. In our contemporary world, there are these events that are inexplicable, that are unexplained, that are strange. Many of them are kind of unrepeatable. They're not scientific in the sense that you can't just make these things happen all the time. It's not like the law of gravity. Gravity just works. These things don't just work. These are unexplained things that happen in our world, but nevertheless, things that there are reams and reams of testimony about. That is to say, I told some stories about Bruce Haig, a doctor who has experienced terminal lucidity. That is to say, people who are in the terminal stages of life who have almost no brain left because of things like cancer or because of injury, and who experience periods of inexplicable lucidity that are scientifically impossible and yet happen. That is to say, they're able to talk and be with their friends and family. Dale Allison, this biblical scholar, has written this book about, again, these aren't things he can prove, but these are things that there's enough testimony about. Things like near-death experiences and experiences people have during them, which is about 5% of people who are alive right now have experienced one of these things, these near-death experiences. About 60% of people in the United States say they've experienced a miracle in one way or another. Now, I don't know how they explain that exactly. The Pew survey doesn't go deep enough to tell us all the details of that. But nonetheless, Dale Allison tells us that these things are actually very common. They're not repeatable, so they're not scientifically provable, but these experiences of strangeness in our world are actually rather common, but people often don't talk about them because they feel like they'd be crazy because of our immanent frame. It's crazy to talk about these things. Well, Dale Allison's trying to remind us it's not crazy to talk about these things, and in fact, that God may be at work through some of these inexplicable things. We talked about Bruce Grayson, this doctor, research doctor at the University of Virginia. He's got a whole lab that works on these near-death experiences and other inexplicable scientific phenomena. He's not crazy. He's got a position at the University of Virginia, and yet he's trying to gather a bunch of information. And I mean, these are anecdotal stories in many ways, but that's all you have to work with these kind of strange encounters, is anecdotal stories. But you get enough of these anecdotal stories together, and maybe they're onto something. So he's got these interesting stories of people perceiving what they think is God in their near-death experiences. And then I finished last time by introducing this story by Andrew Root. He's got a book, Churches in the Crisis of Decline, which has this story in it in great detail. He's got a shorter version of this book called When the Church Stops Working. It's a great book, one that I recommend. So Andrew Root, When the Church Stops Working, which is like a trick title. The Churches in the Crisis of Decline is also a trick title, because if I tell you the decline of the church, the crisis of the decline of the church, you're thinking, oh, like membership going down. And that's what he wants you to think at first, but it's actually a twist. That's not the decline he's talking about. It's the decline of the ability to talk about God's activity in the world. That's the real crisis of the church. Andrew Root's big thing is like, it doesn't matter if there's 10 people going to a church or not. If there's 1 million people going to a single church and no one cares about anything that's happening there, it's all just a social event, it doesn't really matter then. But if there's 10 people going to a church and they experience the presence of God, that church is not in decline, no matter what the budget says. That is to say, the experience of God is the currency of the church. And whether you're declining or growing has very little to do with how many programs you have or how many people are showing up. It has to do with how are people attuned to God's activity in our midst. So that's the crisis of decline he's talking about. And when the church stops working, I'll get to in a minute because it's another little turn of phrase. But all to say, he tells the story of Karl Barth, this famous theologian who starts out as a liberal theologian, not liberal in our political sense today, but liberal in the sense that he mainly was thinking about God in terms of, well, let's say, analogy, symbolism, the idea that God is kind of active in the world, but not active in the world in the way that we think about it as like Jesus was actually doing miracles, right? It's about demythologization. That is to say, thinking of the New Testament as basically the product of a people who were ancient and who had lots of mythologies about how disease worked and things and saw demons around, but we got to get rid of all that. Let's just talk about how kind of God's miracles are really a symbol of the possibility of like, metaphorical new life. So Jesus' resurrection is not really about somebody coming out of the grave. It's really about the possibility of God to make life renew again, as in if I go through a difficult time, I can get better, my life can get better. But it's not really about death and life as real events. That's kind of this world that Karl Barth was coming up through. And he becomes a pastor. And when he becomes a pastor, he ends up saying, it's really hard to say the word God to these people. He's trying to preach about God, and he says, how can I preach about God when the word itself kind of seems weak or dry or trite? I mean, in his day, there were people talking about God a lot, but it ended up being, like I said, some snake oil salesmen and things like that, but also some people who were just kind of using the word God a lot. But it was just kind of about their feelings, but it wasn't about anything actually happening in the world. And then there were a bunch of people using the word God in this kind of symbolic way. And for him, he wanted to find someone who wasn't trying to avoid the modern world. He wanted to believe in modern science. He used lights and he drove a car. He believed the modern world worked. He didn't want to try to get behind it or outside of it. But he also wanted to find a way to talk about God being active in this world that we're in now instead of escaping it or escaping God by going to like symbolism or mythology or something like that. So how does he talk about God? He is having this crisis as a young pastor in his pulpit. And he lived in this, what we call a plausibility structure. We all have a plausibility structure. He was living in this plausibility structure where in reality, like God can't do things within my world. That was his assumption. God doesn't actually do these things like miracles, whatever. This stuff doesn't actually happen. And to be honest, many of us, even who believe in God, find it hard to believe in things like exorcisms or something. Because first of all, you like Google exorcisms and like a bunch of like crazy stuff comes up and stuff that's obviously meant to like take your money, or just like stories that someone's making up, it seems. There's stuff that doesn't seem plausible or believable, right? My plausibility structure filters a lot of the possibility out for these stories about God being active in the world. At that time, though, World War I emerges. And Barth's professors, who are all in the liberal kind of camp, liberal theology at the time, end up circulating or signing on to a letter signed by many academics in Germany at the time, which supports World War I. And Barth freaks out, along with many of his colleagues, many of his young pastors. And they think, my professors are supporting this war, which seems to make no sense to any of us. And how could Jesus be for this war? So in the midst of this crisis of faith that Barth is kind of experiencing, how can God be active in the world, but also like my current theological system is falling apart, he hears this story about Christoph and Johann Blumhardt, and that's Johann Blumhardt on the right. And they were pietist pastors, kind of very fervent, devoted pastors, but also pastors who believed in things like science, in medicine, pastors who were thoroughly modern, German pastors in the Württemberg region of Germany. And there was this young woman, Gottlieben Dittus, who at the time was suffering from some sort of seizures, epileptic seizures. She had some changes to her personality. And then there were some things that started to seem supernatural happening in this area. That is to say, in her house, there were loud noises and Policemen and other inspectors would go into this house. Medical folks would go into the house and try to figure out what was happening. They couldn't find out where these noises were coming from. There were strange voices coming from the house. There were strange things happening. It became a tourist phenomenon. People showed up from all over Germany to hear this kind of loud house making noises all by itself. The police had to make a cordon, make an area to keep people away, tourists away from this house. So there's a lot of independent kind of verification that this strange event started to happen. And Blumhardt starts praying for Gottlieb and Dittus. Now, he doesn't do the demon slayer thing. He's not looking for demons. He's not carrying a cross and throwing holy water at her. And he's not doing any rituals, nothing like that. He just sits and prays. And he gets the elders of the church together and they sit and they pray for a long time. And it's actually 3 years that this woman is kind of afflicted. And at the end of 3 years of basically prayer vigils, that's all they're doing. They're not wandering around Germany looking for other demons to fight or anything like this. They just are praying for this young woman. She finally screams, "Jesus is victor," and in this apparently horrific voice that seems to be kind of inhuman. And they interpret it, Blumhardt interprets this as the demon leaving and says, "Jesus is victor," and then she's fine. And she's fine from there on out. And she attends their church from there on out. And people from all over Germany come to talk to her. People interview her. There's a book that's written. The Blumhardts actually end up writing a book about their experience there. And this phrase, "Jesus is victor," ends up becoming what the Blumhardts call a watchword. A watchword meaning not a mission statement like here's what we're going to do, but a watchword is in here's how we watch for God's activity in the world. Here's the lens we're going to use to interpret ourselves and our neighbors. Jesus is victor. And so when terrible things happen, they tell each other, Jesus is victor. That is to say, it might seem like we're losing, but Jesus is the one who wins. When terrific things happen, they tell each other, Jesus is victor, meaning it's not us who did this, but Jesus who has done this through us. That is to say, they use this as a phrase to interpret God's activity among them. And they call this a watchword. And Bart hears this, and this is so moving for him, that he ends up coming to visit Christoph Blumhardt, the son of Johann Blumhardt, who was there when all this crazy stuff was happening. And Christoph and his father Johann moved to a place called Bad Boll, which is like a kind of a hot springs, like a sauna. And they start this kind of healing ministry. Not miraculous faith healing ministry, but a place like a sanitarium almost, to help people recover their health with prayer. Again, they're not selling snake oil. But nevertheless, there are some people who report being healed in ways that are remarkable. So Karl Barth ends up traveling down to Muttlingen, this place where today you can even find the Blumhardt Kirche, this church where the Blumhardt started. And he goes to Bad Boll, where Christoph Blumhardt was running his healing ministry. And he has these meetings with them because he's thinking, I got to talk to these people because they seem to be faithful believers in Jesus, and they don't seem to be doing this stuff for their own reputation. They don't seem to be making a lot of money off of this. They're not using this to build a giant church. In fact, their church was not giant. They're not manipulating this stuff for their own benefit. They just seem to be witnessing to God. So Bart, this thoroughly modern guy, and doesn't sort of end up going looking for demons or trying to become a faith healer himself. This becomes remarkably important for him, and actually is the foundation for the rest of his theology that he ends up building, which is kind of the cornerstone of contemporary Reformed theology, like our church is a part of. Karl Barth's really important in this because he's one of the first kind of modern theologians, along with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to be what's called neo-orthodox. He's trying to think about the old theology developed by the early church, but think about it in the modern, in our modern world, in our secular lens. How do we do this? And for him, that witness that God is actually active was really important. So he goes back from this meeting. He goes back to his church, kind of a rural church where he was preaching, and this is hugely important to him. And he ends up repeating this phrase over and over again, God is God, which even his last secretary he had, who ended up writing a biography of him, ended up saying, this phrase is kind of nonsensical, it doesn't make any sense, but Bart kept saying it, God is God. It's the same word repeated twice with is in the middle, so it doesn't mean anything. But for Bart, this was hugely important because God is God. That is to say, the God that we're talking about, the God that I'm addressing, I'm talking about the God of Jesus, the God that we talk about, is actually God, is actually free, is actually sovereign, is actually powerful, is actually the one we're talking about. That is to say, the idea of God, there is something, God, that fills that idea. God actually is God. And this Barth talks about this is like the beginning of his like move in theology that ends up building the kind of modern edifice of Reformed theology, which is that it's incoherent. This doesn't make any sense. God is God doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And what Barth says is our world is all about making sense. Like our modern world is all about measuring things, discerning things, like coming up with a solution to this problem. Like how are we going to build this thing that works? How are we going to make this bridge last 100 years? I mean, we're all about making sure about things and figuring things out. And if we can't figure something out, it's just because there's not enough time yet to figure it out. And Barth ends up realizing that within our immanent frame, the only way for God to be God is for God to not make sense. I'm going to say that again. The only way for God to actually be God is for God to not make sense. We can't make sense of God. God's too big to make sense of. And when God acts in our world, it shows up most clearly in nonsensical ways. That is to say, in Barth's day, the conservatives and the liberals were both trying to make sense of God in ways that made sense to them. And Barth is the one in the middle who's saying, actually, we should look to the things that don't make sense, because that's where God is active, because God is beyond our whole world, our whole frame. And so God is not supposed to make sense. But he's trying to create a space where God can actually be God in our world. And we can notice this logic of incoherence. We are supposed to witness to one who can't be explained, who's beyond all explanation, who's beyond all rational thought, one that we can't just sum up in a bunch of words or even in a creed. The creeds, the Nicene Creed, it doesn't make sense. God from God, light from God, true God from true God, begotten. What does that mean? It's beyond our understanding. And Jesus is both 100% human and 100% God. Make sense? No, it's not supposed to. God is beyond us. God is God. It's beyond explanation. It's beyond thought. And so Barth also begins to think about these events that happen in our lives that are beyond our explanation. And these become really important to him as ways that we can point to say, God, this is God at work. And then we have to try to interpret it, not to explain it away, not to make it fit some system, but for us to explain the meaning or the purpose of this wondrous thing, this thing that has made us step back. And instead of just trying to like rationalize it, instead, let's wonder. Let's be moved to wonder. So Barth begins to say that it's not about like us getting outside of our immanent frame to find God. It's about God working in the midst of our immanent frame in ways that confuse us and disturb us and make us not fully understand. One thing to talk about is the ascension, that Jesus ascends, right, to heaven. That Jesus was here among us acting in ways that were confusing, and then Jesus leaves us. When Jesus leaves, what does Jesus leave for us? What's here? What's Jesus' presence now? Yeah, the Holy Spirit, right? Which is conceived in which ways? How do we talk about the Holy Spirit? It's as fire, right? In Deuteronomy 4, God is speaking to Moses, and God says, don't make pictures of me. I don't like pictures. And why does God not like pictures? Well, because pictures kind of contain you or frame you, right? God says, instead, let's talk about fire. If you want to picture me, think about fire. And the fire, the tongues of fire coming. Now, why would God want fire to be an image of God? Because if you try to take a picture of fire, there's the fire right there. Nope, it's different. It's moved. It's changed, right? The fire moves and jumps around in ways that we can't predict, we can't control, we can't explain. Or water, right? The motions, the ocean waves that move in ways that scientists can start to explain in some ways, but also that's fundamentally chaotic. It's fairly random. And the ways that the wind moves around. The Spirit is explained as wind. It's these uncontrollable, and to us at least in our current state, somewhat inexplicable, unpredictable things that produce real effects, but that sometimes you look mysterious. Like when the wind starts to blow something and it catches your attention, you say, what was that? What was that moving? That is to say, Barth starts to say, this is kind of how God works in the world. And this is because God is bigger than us and God is sovereign. When we read the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, right, we hear of the rending of the curtain in the temple, that God's presence in the Holy of Holies of the temple was somehow kind of let out on the loose and moved around. That God is kind of out there. If there's some place that you want to go, in other words, to find God, the point of that in the story is that you can't. There's no place you can go to find God. God's bigger than that. And God's active. God's out on the loose. God's not there for you to go seek and find. You can't go on a journey to find God. And this is what Barth is saying. God is God. You're not. You can't find God. Instead, we have to wait. That's actually the church's job. When Andy Root's book, When the Church Stops Working, it's about how we today are told to get busy, get active, do your thing. And we fill up our lives with all this busy work because busyness and work is where we find meaning and productivity and purpose. And we need to do more. That's kind of what we tell ourselves, and that's what we're told. And what Root says is actually the church needs to stop working and needs to wait. Waiting is actually the church's job, waiting for God to do something and being prayerful and watching. This is not to say we don't do anything, service projects of food and helping people who don't have homes. This is all really important. But when we're doing those things, we're not finding God. We're not out there doing God's work, finding God in the same way. We are called to serve our neighbors, and we're also called to keep our eyes open. How is God active in our midst? So that is to say, we're not going to earn our way or work our way to something like a miracle. You can't go around trying to cast out demons and be I heard the story, I'm going to go do it. These things happen to you, and if it's you, then you probably aren't looking for it. You can't capture it or do this yourself. And so Andy Root tells the story of the early church. Jesus ascends to heaven and tells them, I'll send you the Holy Spirit sometime. And when? Jesus says, you don't know the day or hour. See y'all later. And what is the first thing that the disciples do? They pick a new disciple to fill Judas's role. And they pick this guy, Matthias, who you never hear from again. I guess he wasn't very important. But they do the work of church administration in God's absence. Well, let's get busy. Let's have a session meeting. Let's do some stuff, right? They start to do some stuff. And that stuff actually ultimately is fairly unimportant. That is to say, nothing really happens from it. But then when they're all sitting there waiting and apparently doing nothing, that's when the Holy Spirit comes, and that's when the church explodes. That is to say, the sitting around, waiting, actually watching for God to work is going to be the site of God's activity. And God's probably doing these things all the time, but if we're not waiting and sitting and watching, we might not notice. Or we might not be able to interpret or to give meaning to this. So this idea that we're not out there to find God. If someone comes to this church and says, I want to find God, how do I find God? What would we tell them? What's that? How to find you. Yeah. We don't know how to find God. That's the first thing we need to tell people who come to us and say, I want to find God. Can you show me? We need to say, I can't do that. I'm sorry. I don't know how to find God, but I have faith that God finds us. Do you want to wait with us? Do you want to wait with us for God to find us? And this is Bart's big move, is to say it's starting by saying, it's not us. We don't actually have the ability to do this. It's not up to us. Do you want to wait with us? And do you want to watch with us? And that's why the watch word was so important for Bart. That Jesus is victor isn't about us. It's not about something we're doing. It's about us watching for God's activity in the world. So we can add maybe waiting. That we wait. That's actually the big task of the church, to wait together faithfully. And like I said, to serve others and to help others as we wait. But the serving isn't the point or the end. That's a thing we're doing as we wait for God to give us direction, to show us what God is doing in this world. And if God shows up in our midst of our service, we hope God does. But we can't make God show up because we're doing the right things. So if we wait faithfully, and then an event happens, and we wonder together, what did that mean? And then we witness, and we tell people about this, and we invite them to come wait with us for God to work again. So there's this guy, Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist who's written a bunch of really interesting works. He's a student of Charles Taylor, who I started talking about with secularism. So Hartmut Rosa is a very interesting German thinker. He's got some great kind of podcasts he's been on, so you can hear him. But he has these long books, one about resonance and one about uncontrollability. But his main point is that in our contemporary world, we accelerate. To do more, to move faster, to do as much as you possibly can, to increase your accessibility, your attainability, what can you do, what do you have possible to you, the world at your fingertips, how big is it, can you make it bigger, can you make your footprint bigger? This is kind of how we are pushed every day to live, and our worth, our purpose is often to increase our ability to do more. And what Hartmut Rosa says is this is actually kind of counterintuitive, but this is actually this is the way to have the least amount of purpose and meaning in your life possible. Because the more you're trying to do, the less you're actually like experiencing what you're doing. You're just trying to get to the next activity. So I'm like power walking my dog at like 6 a.m, like listening to a podcast on double speed so that I can like get to the next thing, so that I can, do more in my day. And what he says, this is actually a shortcut to never experiencing anything in your life. And he says, these moments that are true and real in our life are moments of what he calls resonance. And these are often uncontrollable moments. They're beyond our control. You ever had that moment where you're sitting there like looking at the Grand Canyon or something, and all of a sudden it just kind of, the world hits you, maybe God hits you, like you just feel woozy almost, like this world is amazing, you're overcome, and you ever like go to a place like the Grand Canyon, be like, I'm gonna feel that feeling, and then you don't? It's not up to you, right? That is to say, you can put yourself in these places and these times where you want to experience resonance, and it can be difficult, but we have to kind of, as a church, where does our resonance, where are we waiting for God's resonance, that moment of experience, of deep resonance? And prayer is that time, right, where we try to set aside for this, individual and communal prayer. Why do we pray? To like make God do what we want? Maybe, sort of, but really, why do we pray? Because we're creating some time and space for God to work in us, for God to open our eyes, for us to be attuned to God. That this is more than like making a miracle happen with your prayer. Prayer is really a space for us to get attuned to God, to create those spaces of resonance, or make us at least feel open to it. I'm near the end, sorry, we'll get to our own discussion, but I got a couple of things to say. One is this, Tanya Luhrmann is a Stanford sociologist. She's a really fascinating person, an anthropologist, really fascinating person who's done a lot of ethnographic studies of religious organizations. And she herself is kind of like agnostic. She's not anti-faith. She's also not committed to a particular faith, but she's very open to these kind of conversations about experience of God. And so she went to these evangelical communities and did these ethnographies. That is to say, she did these deep interviews with folks and actually ended up sitting in on like prayer times with these folks about prayer. And she was like, do you think God speaks to you? And, a chunk of Christians say, yes, God audibly speaks to me. And of course, in the, DSM-4, if you hear audible voices, that is to say that if you're a psychologist or, and you hear someone say, I hear audible voices, that's not good, right? This is a problem, right? This is a disorder, a malfunction, right? So she ended up sitting in this community, really to say, are these people mostly psychotic, right? Are these people experiencing some sort of break? Are they hearing actual voices? If so, what's going on? And she ends up spending a couple of years deep in these evangelical communities, and she ends up coming away saying, no, first of all, they're not crazy. But second of all, this really amazing thing happens when you sit and you pray. If you spend a long time in prayer, individual and communal, and you actually kind of think about God as being real with you, and you actually carry on like a conversation with God, not necessarily rote prayers, but just like if you kind of think about God being there with you, and you really focus on that for a long time, it becomes true. And what she's saying is it true in a scientific sense? She says, no, I don't have anything to say about that. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not making claims about theology. But what she says is it becomes real in a psychological sense. And she says it doesn't lead to other psychotic activity. It's not associated with things like mental disorders, the other kind of behaviors that go along with other kinds of people who say they hear voices. These don't happen with these folks. That is to say, this is something kind of strange. But she ends up making the argument this is actually a deeply human thing. And she's got a new book out called, there you go, How God Becomes Real. And she goes more in depth into this process. And so again, she's an anthropologist. She's talking to neuroscientists. She's trying to figure out what are the mechanisms of the human brain that generate this feeling that God is real and that God is with you. And really what she says is the main and really the only thing is just focus. If you spend time and you focus on it and you develop your focus on this, you start to sense God's presence. And again, she's just saying this from a purely scientific point of view. You begin to sense God's presence. She herself is, doesn't come down anywhere on what she thinks about this, but she did say at the end of her book, When God Talks Back, she has an appendix where she says, I tried these practices, and I have to admit, it felt real. Again, she stops short of saying anything particular about this, about her own life and her own beliefs. But she says, I did this for a while, and this works. So, in any event, that's an interesting thing. But she talks about absorption. And so there are certain people that have a propensity to be absorbed in things more than others. And so certain people can do this easier than others, but everyone can. It just might take more work for some than others. But she talks about the difference between adsorption and absorption. Absorption means when the molecules just then get drawn into the material like a sponge. The water's inside there. And adsorption is when the molecules are kind of on the surface, like a chamois, right? That's why chamois are nice, because the water rolls right off. And she talks about how we live in an age of adsorption. We are like a fire stream of, like a fire hose of water, of information is always coming at us, and it's always just kind of rolling off us. And she talks about how this is the opposite, like the experience of presence of God requires this absorption, which is really hard to do in our day and age, but it can happen. She talks about people like Sufi mystics, the whirling dervishes, like Rumi. Anyone ever read the poetry of Rumi? It's beautiful poetry, but he says this stuff as he's in a state. He's in something like a fugue state, which I don't know if you've ever been driving your car, and then you got home and you don't remember how you got there. Yeah, has that ever happened to you? That was a fugue state. You were in a fugue state. It's okay. However, our culture tells us that's not okay. It's dangerous, it's weird. But people all over the world, all throughout history, have experienced these things. And there's some cultures that tell people, no, this is okay. That's okay, go with that. That's fine. Open yourself up to that. And these are folks who experience mystic stuff. These are mystics. They're people who are open themselves up to something like a fugue state. So, all to say that this is the opposite of how our world works today. We're in an attention-based economy. Your attention is the number one resource in the world right now, and everything's fighting for your attention. That is to say, your phones are designed, my phone is designed to make me desire that hit of dopamine I get from pushing the check email button, even if I hate the email I'm getting, right? That is to say, we are stuck in a loop, and breaking this loop and trying to get this place of deep focus is what's required for us to really be open, I think, to God's presence in the world. So how do we do that? That's a really difficult thing, but we can talk more about that too. And just to give us examples, I'll end with some examples of folks that seem to have kind of achieved some of these deep states. This guy, Brother Lawrence. Anyone ever read The Practice of the Presence of God? It's like a early modern, late medieval text by this guy, Brother Lawrence. He was a brother in a monastery. He was injured in a war, and he ended up being like serving in basically the kitchen of a monastery. And he was like a low servant. And eventually, people started to realize this guy seems to always be happy. He seems to be filled with like contentment and bliss. And they asked him how he does it, and he says, well, I just talk to God all day long. And so he wrote this book called The Practice of the Presence of God, about his own way of just kind of carrying on this conversation with God all day long. And it's a way that developed in him to help other people see God, like actually at work in their lives, even in little things, not just big miracles. Or Thomas Merton, who was walking down the street in Knoxville, and all of a sudden was just overwhelmed. He was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people. He sees everyone on this one street corner, and there's actually a historical marker at this intersection in Knoxville, where he saw all of a sudden everyone was like on fire. Everyone was burning like a sun, he said. And he was filled with this deep love for people. And that vision energized his social ministry for the rest of his career. It changed the way he saw other people, just like Brother Lawrence, who was really happy to serve his brothers in the monastery because of his experience of God. And then Mother Teresa. I don't know if you've heard this, but she had some visions on a train in India. And her experiences of vision, Jesus told her what to do, go help the poor. And she ended up doing that. And Mother Teresa herself says that for much of her career as a nun helping these folk on the street in India, for much of her time serving, she felt a horrible absence of God, but she nevertheless kept doing her work. This kind of dark night of the soul, she felt an absence of God's presence. But nonetheless, because of these visionary experiences, it gave her the fuel that she needed to kind of push on through. And in part, it was her praying, focused on a train in India. Or the Bloomharts, folks that were all about prayer, but also were open to God's activity in the world, and saw and felt God's presence. So, a couple things to tie together there is all of those folks that I just put up there, they were all humble. They were all not trying to make God happen or do it themselves, but nevertheless, God's presence in their lives, which was a part of was kind of made real for them because of their deep focus and their attention, was also interpreted by them as something that sparked them to serve others in this world and to witness through their service. That is to say, this is kind of a model for how Karl Barth saw God's activity in the world. And I wonder, so for me, I want to ask us to take some time. We have about 20 minutes here, so if we would have some courage, you don't have to say yes to this, or you don't have to know anything. Also, these can be small things or big things, but I wonder if we can take some time and turn to a neighbor or someone we trust kind of near us. And if we, groups of 3, 4, 5, it doesn't matter to me. You can turn your chairs if you want or move around. But if you want to find someone that you could talk to, and maybe just ponder this question, where have you sensed God as tangibly present or active in your life? This could be a story from long ago. It could be a miraculous story of something amazing happening to you or to someone you know. But it could also be something little, something small, some way that God showed up. But how do you perceive God as being actually active in your life? Not as a symbol or a metaphor, but also not like, in some kind of faraway la-la land. How is God actively, tangibly present in your real life today? So we're going to talk about this for a few minutes, be able to share, and then I'm going to open it up the last few minutes. If there are folks that want to share these kind of publicly, I've got a microphone. I'll walk around. I'll let us kind of talk to each other about this. No pressure to share, but I'll say this is our time to chat with one another about this. Questions? All right, let's take some time and chat. Where have you seen or sensed God as active or tangibly present in your life? I know we're deep in conversation, but if we could gather back together, maybe we can start these conversations up again sometime. I'd love to ask you for all of your stories, but we don't have time here for all of that. But one thing I want to ask you about is the meaning of these stories that you've just shared. If you're going to sum up the meaning of some of these stories, does anyone want to share, like, what is your experience that you just shared? What does it mean? What is it trying to say? What's your witness about this story? Is there anyone? We don't have to. No one needs to share. We don't need to hear all the details of every story, but at least here and now. But what does this story mean that you just shared? Yes. Here, if you wouldn't mind, just so folks can hear. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's just that, and I think we'll all agree here that what you were talking about earlier too is that God finds us. And I think in all of those situations, God did for us what we needed to hear, or the person we needed to encounter, or the prayers that we need answered for us. And so he finds us if we ask for his guidance and then wait. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful, Lucille. Thank you. Yeah. So God's presence, God finds us, and God is with us. This is something that you find in like Exodus when you read about Moses. It's always that God was with Moses, God was with Moses. And this was the tangible presence of God was felt in all of these amazing things that happened with him. Yeah.
I just want to say my husband passed away last October the 10th. God has been with me, and his love for me has carried me through, helps me go to each day with happiness and peace, and I feel his presence.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. Thanks. Yeah. So God finds us. God is present with us in grief and bringing us to a sense of wholeness and being loved by God. Yeah, that's often like the kind of the output of that, like the kind of the end result, right? Is this feeling that God actually is with us. God's actually for us. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Thanks, Lucy.
Well, you mentioned that God is God doesn't make sense. And it really doesn't. It's sort of a strange sentence. But God is God. And the thing that I have sort of picked up from these lessons is that we've got to wait. And that is so countercultural to our lifestyles. And we just want to just be busy and do and have our to-do list and check it off. And that's never going to happen. And God's just waiting. He's waiting on us too to pay attention.
Yeah, so that sense of our own attention and our own focus is often something that God actually desires. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Please. Yeah.
I think in what we talked about, too, was there's that element that something is unexplained, and that's what makes it a miracle.
And that we often can't make these things happen, and we can't redo it. Frederick Buechner, one of my favorite authors, a great Presbyterian author, writes about a dream he had after a very good friend of his died suddenly. He had a dream that his friend came to visit him and was wearing this bright red sweater. And he wakes up and he sees this long thread of bright red yarn on his floor. And he doesn't own a red sweater or anything. He says, "What do I do with this?" And Frederick Buechner goes to the doctor and he, listens to people talk about the signs of the stars, and he's not, but what does he do with this, right? And that and he writes about this, that he doesn't know exactly what happened, but he believes God was with him. And that's this message that we hear. Yeah, other stories, other thoughts?
This is kind of a weird story, but last year my husband died 7 years ago, and my daughter and my granddaughter went to a family reunion in Florida, and we were on the way back in the car, and I got a text message, and it said, Dear family, I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you. I love you all. David Hagee. And Sarah said, who was that from? I said, I think your father just texted us. Well, it turned out it was another relative who does have the same name in California. But it was just something that gave us a real sense of peace. And, how often does that happen? And I'd just like to mention one other thing. I'm reading a book right now called Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer. And it's about scientists, astrophysicists, talking about, how the world began, but a lot of them are going back and saying through the information that we have now scientifically that there probably is a God. And it's just fascinating that these men have learned, like you, that are above me intellectually, that are coming back to God.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and folks, like at my college graduation, Francis Watson, was the head of the National Institute of Health, was speaking, and he's one of the guys who's important in synthesizing the DNA of humans, of humanity. And he's a Christian who talked at our graduation about how he still believes in God, and how can this be possible? But all at the same time, these when you talk to folks, often scientists feel a little uncomfortable talking about that stuff in public. But it's true that sharing these stories actually is important. It's an important part of our faith and their faith too. Yeah. But that story of the text, that's fascinating too, because you can explain that one. There's an explanation for it, and yet there's more. And one of the things about the miracles is this unexplained element really is important. This kind of parts of our lives that don't make sense. But sometimes you can't actually make sense of these things, and yet there's this extra dimension, right? How could it be that David Hagee texted you, right? Does that make sense? And you didn't know he was texting and all that. And that bonus meaning that comes from it, that does give you a sense that, God is with us. Yeah. So, any final thoughts? Anyone want to share any more? Well, let me end with this, to say thank you for being with me and trusting me with your stories today, trusting each other with your stories. I ask that we just continue to talk about these things, not just here, but just that this could be a part of this church. We just talk about this stuff with each other. We tell each other how God is active in our lives in real and concrete ways. And we wait together and we watch together. What would our watchword be? I don't know, but it's a good question, I think. And I'll be back doing something like this in December for Advent. And I'll be talking then about the incarnation, leading up to the birth of Jesus in December. But why would I pick that? Not just because of Christmas, but because it builds on what we've been doing here. This is David Bartlett's book, Fact and Faith, Coming to Grips with Miracles in the New Testament. David passed away a few years ago, but he was a colleague of mine at Columbia Theological Seminary in the New Testament department. Wonderful guy as well. But here's how he ends his book on miracles in the New Testament, which I do recommend. He says, our understanding of miracles and resurrection provides clues for understanding the New Testament's affirmations about God's incarnation in Jesus of Nazareth. The whole incarnation is a kind of miracle. As with other miracles, God's activity in Jesus was visible, tangible. In Jesus, God entered into the everyday, empirical world and made himself known in concrete historical events. However, the concrete historical events weren't enough to compel the recognition that God was active in this man, Jesus. The events, the acts, the words themselves, they led some to believe only that he was a wandering magician or a preacher, or worse than that, a troublemaker who threatened God and the state. It took faith to perceive in those odd events the signs of God's activity. It took faith to perceive that that odd man had in him the fullness of God's loving revelation. As with the New Testament understandings of miracles and resurrection, the New Testament understanding of Jesus requires both a respect for what has happened in history and a faith which can perceive what happened in the history and activity of God. God's incarnation in Jesus Christ is the central miracle of the New Testament. Therefore, the other miracles and even the miracle of resurrection are not held to be as important in themselves. They are important because they point to Jesus. They bear witness to the fact that God is active in Jesus. They indicate the ways that God is active in Jesus, forgiving, loving, and redeeming humankind. These miracles were used to evoke faith in Jesus Christ, not just as a miracle worker, but as the gift and revealer of God's own love. And may it be so in our own lives today. Amen. Thank you all for sticking with me. Peace.